By me, I work in the Army Cyber Institute, and I get the pleasure of introducing the afternoon panel. I would like to run this as a very interactive conversation, so please start thinking of your questions ahead of time, because I guarantee you time is going to fly once you hear what these two gentlemen have to share with us today. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker, Brian David Johnson, and his business is the future. His work is called THREATCASTING, and what he does is he works with organizations to envision the future 10 years into the future, or 10 years out, and help them identify ways forward and ways to make futures that are desirable happen and futures that are undesirable not happen, or at least less likely to happen. He's worked with many organizations globally, both in and out of government. And he holds two hats. He is the chief or the futurist in residence at Arizona State University, but he's also a fellow at Frost and Sullivan. And without further ado, Mr. Brian David Johnson.
Thank you, Fernando. So I think how we're going to do this is I'm going to talk for about 20, 25 minutes, then we'll do a few questions, and then we'll kind of move on. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to start my timer, because I know it's important we stay on time. Well, hey everybody. As Fernando said, my name is Brian David Johnson. I'm a futurist. Again, I work with organizations that need to make decisions today that may not pay off for 10 years. But I not only help people model the future, I also say, well, what are the steps we need to take today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, to get to those futures we want and avoid the futures that we don't want. A lot of the work that I do in industry is called future casting. It's actually looking at the future of industries and products and things like that. About 7 years ago, I was starting to work with the DoD. We started working on this thing called threat casting. And threat casting is very similar, and that's what I'm going to walk you through today, the sort of the process of threat casting, how we go about looking 10 years out, understanding what the future threats might be, and then backcasting from there, saying how do we take action today about that. But more specifically, I want to be able to walk you through a preliminary report out of some work that I have been doing with the Army Cyber Institute on doing a threat cast. And I have the preliminary results for that, and the title of that paper, which will be coming out very soon, is called a Widening Attack Plane. So let's start with the threat casting process. So the way it works, and I'm going to go down here because you can stop looking at me and start looking at this. So here we are in 2016, and we want to get out to 2026. So how do we do it, right? So the first step is to say, all right, we start with social science. So we want to get a social science and ethnographic understanding of our actors, right? Understanding what drives them, what they want, what they don't want, what do they want to avoid. The great thing about that is that people don't change all that much. But we have to have an understanding that even when we're doing work in cyber in the digital domain, it's all about people. It starts with people and it ends with people, but it's all about people. So we start with a social science understanding first, and again, defining our actors. The next step, looking 10 years out, we look at the technical capabilities. This is the world that I really come from. For 15 years, I was the chief futurist at the Intel Corporation. So for them, I helped to design the chip 10 years before. Because it takes them about 10 years to design, develop, and deploy a chip. So I was the guy who wrote the spec to say, this is what the chip will need to do 10 years from now. I'm an engineer and a designer by training. And so I'm very comfortable in this domain, sort of understanding what are the technical capabilities. How will people be able to use this technology that we see coming? And we have a pretty good idea, especially as you look 10 years out on that time horizon, what can come. The next step in this process is to look at kind of a basket of things. Number one, we look at the cultural history. History is incredibly important with this type of work because history is the on-ramp for the future, or a different way to put it is history gives us a language to talk about the future. I do a lot of work with historians, and what they will tell you is, well, history doesn't actually repeat itself, but history is the language that we use to talk about what's going on today. Also, I do work in economics. Everybody talks about that. That's the math of the future. Everybody talks about where that's going. I also do work in this thing called trend spotting. This is a very specific practice that actually comes out of the fashion industry, where they actually go and use this process to say, okay, if this are the jeans that Japanese teenagers are wearing today, then what jeans will teenagers in Chicago be wearing 2 years from now? I don't do that. I use it as a way to look at cultural trends and different indicators of public opinion and where things are going. Finally, the next step in this process is to say, to go out and talk to experts. For anybody who's sort of trained in foresight, this is the Delphi method, actually going out and talking to change makers, people who have budget control, people who have an opinion that really matters, that could move the needle. I use a little bit of science fiction to do this modeling, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But ultimately, what we get to is based upon all of these inputs, these multidisciplinary, sort of wide-ranging inputs, we start to say, well, based upon all of this, what is the future we want and what's the future we want to avoid when it comes to these threats? And we start identifying what these threats might look at, what might be like. Then the real power of this is where we turn around and look backwards. To say, okay, if we've mapped this threat landscape and this multiple threat landscape, how do we look backwards and say, all right, let's look at an event. And an event is the physical or digital instantiation of the threat. So the threat is out there, but it really only matters when it comes and has an effect, when it lands. So then once we've said that, we can say, all right, well then how do we disrupt it? How do we mitigate it? And how do we recover from it? I guess mitigate kind of disappeared there. So you've got disrupt, mitigate, and recover from it. And what this allows us to do is start to creating these threat logs. To say, what are the steps then that we need to take today to start disrupting, mitigating, and preparing for a recovery from it? Also, one of the things that we build into this process is something called flags. And flags are something that, as an organization, whoever I'm doing this modeling with, flags are something that the organization has no control over whatsoever. But the moment the flag happens, there's no going back from it at all. And it will meaningfully affect both the positive and negative future of what you are doing. For a lot of my corporate clients, this would be something like a global recession, so that when it happens, they know what to do. I think, great example, I'm doing a threat casting right now on autonomy, so autonomy in land, sea, and air with the US Air Force Academy. And when one of my cadets was doing this modeling this summer, unfortunately, the tragedy in Dallas happened where a remote-controlled robot was used to take out the shooter. That was a flag. For him, as he was modeling autonomy, you don't go back from that. You don't go back from a civilian protection force using a semi-autonomous vehicle to be able to do that. So we start to kind of map all of that out. Now, the point of this is to give us a framework to understand these disparate inputs, to actually start getting an understanding of what this future landscape might look like, and then to give us sort of this actionable roadmap for things that we need to look out for and areas that we need to intervene, places where we need to envelop, invest, partner, all that. So what I want to do now with the time that I have left is I want to walk you through the work that I've been doing with the Army Cyber Institute. So the idea that we put down there is like, let's do a threat casting. So we got together on these dates in August. We had a room full of people, and a lot of this is I facilitate groups doing this. I facilitate the practitioners who will be working to bring about these futures. I would never be so arrogant to come in and say, here's all the threats and here's what you need to do and take care of it. That's ridiculous. Anybody does that, they didn't do enough work and they don't understand the complexity of this. I work with the practitioners to kind of understand and get them to model the future and then do that backcasting. And in that room that day, we had about 50% sort of Army and DoD folks, and then we had 50% from industry as well as from civilian forces, like we had the top cyber cop from the NYPD was in the room. So we had a nice mix of folks to actually kind of help us do that. So the first place I want to sort of, as we get into the results, we very specifically curated the inputs. So in any model, the inputs matter. And so for us, we focus specifically on increasing artificial intelligence. What will that mean for the threat landscape? Number two, complex automated systems. We know that as we move 5 to 10 years in the future, we're having more autonomy in land, sea, and air. So we wanted to look at those complex systems. Thirdly, we brought in supply chain disruptions. And we very specifically did this because supply chain oftentimes is where the digital or the cyber can become physical. That we can actually start to see breakdowns in the supply chain, which can have not only huge physical threats, but can also lead to kinetic threats. And then as a final bit, we looked at terrorists and technology, how terrorists sort of can use technology. These being sort of terrorists, but also hacktivists or even vandals. So these were our inputs, and these inputs are specific and important because they basically narrow the field just a little bit. right? Because we're not trying to solve everything, we're narrowing it just a little bit. So what did we start learning? So what we did in this, the way the threat casting works is you design multiple futures. You model multiple futures. We don't do just one. So what we do is we say, based upon all these macro inputs, we do a micro future. So we do a person in a place with a problem. That's that event. And then we figure out how to disrupt, mitigate, and recover from that event. So it's very micro. And we do about, we did about 20 different futures. And you start to aggregate these together to start to understand that threat landscape. So one of the things that was very interesting, and I pulled out from the results, was that the actors were pretty stable. I've been doing threat casting for a while. The actors, there weren't a lot of new actors in this, which was interesting. But I want to lead off by giving you one example that I think really typifies the types of modeling that came out. So I want to take you to 10 years into the future. It's 2026. You're Mike. You're in Red Hook, New Jersey. You're a frontline supply chain manager, sort of working at a port, sort of watching the sort of movement of goods. All of a sudden, you start seeing a spike in perishable goods orderings. These are things like milk or baby formula. And when you're watching it, you just think it's a glitch. You just think it's like a weird thing. You're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's got to be a glitch in the system. Next, what starts happening is this spike in ordering sends the autonomous ordering and delivery system kind of doing its thing, right? Because we know from an efficiency standpoint that we just want to get these things to start moving. So you not only have autonomy in delivery, so autonomy, land, sea, and air, we talked about that this morning, but you also have autonomy in delivery. So one of the things that was an input to this was to say, well, we're going to have more smart cities, more smart homes, we'll have more smart devices, Internet of Things, and so that refrigerator can start ordering milk. So it starts ordering, so you can start seeing that autonomy and things start moving up and things start piling up. So at the port, where Mike lives, things start piling up, orders start piling up. And they're perishable. So it means that the mayor and the community start getting angry. They start pushing. You've got to get these goods out. These things are going to start spoiling. You've got industry getting all upset. And so what you do, you speed it up, right? You've got to keep things moving. You've got to keep things going. And then there's a dirty bomb attack in New York City. How'd it happen? Well, it was a blended attack. We talked about these a bit this morning. So first off, we have artificial intelligence. You have artificial intelligence watching the plane, watching the attack plane, looking for vulnerabilities. These could be from, here it would be from a terrorist or a state actor, and starting to see these vulnerabilities and start to getting an understanding of, oh, if I essentially start to do a DDoS attack on an automated system of delivery, it starts to open up a hole. So what do? You send malware out, right, to these Internet of Things, so that refrigerator, maybe the refrigerator's not going haywire, but maybe it's ordering the milk a day before, 2 days before it would normally, right? Because we know our supply chains are actually quite fragile when it comes to perishable goods sometimes, so you can actually start flooding the system. The thing that we really teased out from this was that efficiency is easy to hack. I'm going to say this again. This gentleman is nodding. Okay. A lot of people, it like blows their mind. The world that I come from, you are rewarded for efficiency. Right? You are rewarded for driving down your costs and getting efficiency. In Silicon Valley, you are rewarded by shipping. You ship. It's efficiency. And efficiency is really easy to hack. So that's what they do. So what happens is all the perishable goods, they're getting sent out. It deprioritizes, really simple things that can sort of sit on the crates for a while, like little optical scanners or little tiny replacement parts. Well, that's what happens. So the scanners at the port start to go down because there's a flood of perishable goods going out. So the scanners start to go down, but they have to start pushing things through. A physical vulnerability is now opened up at the port because they're trying to push so many goods through. And so you have the dirty bomb attack in New York. So these types of things we pull together into a framework. And a framework in threat casting is just a way to take all of these different futures and start to make sense of them. So here's the framework that we came up with. It is called the widening attack plane because what we're starting to see is that attack plane getting wider. For a lot of you folks, this won't be new, but as we started talking sort of outside of the military, that this is something that is quite new and quite frightening. So we have the cyber domain, right, of data and digital. But what we started to see is that we'll have the ability to do micro-targeting. So you actually target a single person. Next, you can move from the cyber to the cyber social to the cyber physical. We talked about this with supply chains. Oftentimes this was the go dark scenarios where things go down. And then ultimately we move from a blended attack that goes all the way across. And you have all these blended attacks that go all the way to the kinetic. So what this became really interesting and why these frameworks become very helpful is it starts to identify, what do we do? Who has responsibility? Let's think about this attack plane. So you've got the digital. Well, a lot of this we know, right? This we know, this is data, right? This is criminals, this is espionage. We see a lot of this going on. And again, in this we were modeling the role of the Army and the role of the DoD. But as we start to move up across the attack plane, it becomes really different. So when you move into the cyber social, the Army, there's not a lot the Army can do. I mean, if you're a soldier, you're part of a soldier's family, possibly. But what we're talking about is people in industry, average folks. And you have the ability to actually target them. And also with AI, you have the ability to orchestrate the targeting of them, to destabilize, to be able to influence. Next one, and this is the one that I find probably most interesting from my background in industry, is you've got the cyber to cyber social to cyber physical. These are your go darks, your brownouts, your supply chain disruptions. You have autonomous systems in commercial production that will be disrupted. And the fact of the matter is, in most of the areas, the Army and the DoD does not have much of a role to play here. Actually, they can't. There's a lot of things that they can't do. Now, granted, if we go to war, and there's ways to do that, yes, but in sort of the normal landscape, the responsibility falls squarely on corporations in the private sector. And then finally, we have a completely blended attack, which is more like traditional warfare or blended cyber warfare, which does very much squarely fall in the Army and the DoD with cooperation with corporations as we get into kinetic. So what I did, and as I start to kind of wrap things down into the findings, what this allowed us to do is then start taking these different attacks. So we took all those different inputs and we started saying, well, where do they fall on this? So we had the data, we had digital, we had social studies. We started getting an understanding of what the attack plane would look like and where were the attacks coming. Again, these can be with offensive and defensive approaches. But then you also have some here, which I just like this one because I'm a little bit of a history buff. Right? You have this one where you might have just a data attack that leads to a kinetic attack, also known as very traditional warfare. This happens all the time. But that also doesn't mean it has to go all the way across. So for us, I started mapping, and you'll see in the final report as we come out, these actually map to very specific threats that were modeled by the teams and the backcasts to look at these different areas. And this was the second group of them, and this is ultimately what the attack plane started looking like. These were all of the different attacks that we came up with. Again, some of them, like here, they skipped over the social. They didn't actually have a social attack. They weren't needed, but some of them certainly did. Some of them used that micro-targeting. So ultimately, the goal of this is to say, well, what do we do about it? So the first step is to say, well, what are these 10-year out threats? How do we cluster them together? How do we start kind of getting an idea so that we can start taking action? So what do we do? So this is really the clustering exercise that we started seeing that, again, we know with artificial intelligence, with big data, with the Internet of Things, with smart cities, with increased automation, we're going to have an incredible amount of vulnerabilities for complex automated systems. And again, I go back and say to you, efficiency is easy to hack. And the majority of the people who are building these systems optimize for efficiencies. In the 15 years I spent at Intel, that's what you do. You optimize for efficiency. Next, we're beginning to see the weaponization of data. This has been talked about, right? That you can start to use data. Again, when you take data to social, it makes it these very specific attacks. But it starts to destabilize trust. And I want to pause here for a moment. And this is not just trust in trust of economic systems or trust in government or trust in military, trust in the media. When you have an artificial intelligence that feeds into an automated system, that is fed by data, and you can spoof that data, not just like GPS. GPS is a great example, but if you can start to spoof that data, you can actually start to lose trust in reality. That you can actually start, that the system itself, go with me here, the system itself, this automated system is actually living in a different reality than what you were living in. Next, you can start to use data as offense against these systems. So again, these systems are based upon the information. That is actually where all of its understanding of reality comes from. What you can start to do with an understanding, again, efficiency being easy to hack. A great example is our news cycle, right? Basically, we've got a handful of algorithms on a handful of websites that aggregate our news for us. Some of it's true, some of it's not true. These algorithms are only basically there to, number one, efficiently filter it, and then number two, they're more interested in ad revenue than they are about actual truth. So you actually begin, so if we start pulling from these complex automated systems to then use them, you can start to use it as a weapon. Secondly, we're starting to see AI as a weapon, and this is AI, again, both offense, defense. So one way of thinking about it is AI watching the plane. So we're talking about this attack plane, that you can start to use AI as a way of watching what's going on, feeding back into you, feeding different goals that you have, different areas that you want, and you can start to see openings in the attack plane that normal analysts may not be able to see. And then also you can weaponize it that you're actually using AI to do the attack as you're attacking these automated systems. And the end part, this was one that certainly came out because of the work that we had done around physical supply chain, is that with supply chain, and many of the supply chain folks that we do work with, we actually worked with a lot of supply chain trade associations. They realize that the center of their supply chains are quite robust. They have actually quite, when it comes to cybersecurity, it's quite good. But their number one worry is the fringes. It's the mom and pop shop, it's the little factory, it's the people who are out there who can do that one little thing, make that one little part, do that one little part of the app that nobody else can do, and it's cheap and it's easy, and it's really easy to break in. And so what they're starting to do, and even from this work as we shared it with them, they're looking at their supply chains and saying, well, if you're going to look at this as a critical system, we have to start supplying, we have to start working with those fringes to harden those fringes. Because one of the things that also comes out from industry, from my background, is getting hacked is bad for business, right? Poor cybersecurity is turning out as people are actually seeing that as bad for business. And by the way, in industry, when it's bad for business, they'll do things. Like, it's about money. So what do? These are some of the things that we started bubbling up, and some of these have actually even come up in some of the conversations that have been today. Certainly there needs to be new norms and new roles. As I mentioned, that there's a part to play for everybody here, and I think there's a broader responsibility, and a broader responsibility that goes out into the private sector. There's a lot of things that the DoD and that the government cannot do. And that there needs to be a broader conversation as well. And when I say norms, norms for me come from that sort of world of high tech. It doesn't have to be regulations or laws. It doesn't even have to be standards. There are norms that we take on around how we do things. And there is an incredible lack of norms right now, and a lack of language around what that is. And so one of the things as well that we pushed for is to have a much broader public-private academic conversation, but really talking to the public about this. Because as the gentlemen both said this morning, the way that the news cycle works, the news cycle makes money by scaring the heck out of you. Now, I do a lot of work in fear. I actually do a lot of work in kind of the future of fear and the effect of fear. And what I'll just tell you is that a lot of the neuroscientists that I work with, one of them put it perfectly. He said, Brian, fear makes you stupid. And that's essentially what's happening, is a lot of the media and a lot of the way we're talking about this, and I can show you so many different examples, right? Even when we talk about it this morning, even that PowerPoint that was really cool this morning for the gentleman from Raytheon, where we were flying over the city, and it was like we were like bombing the city when we were talking about stuff. That's not exactly what it's like, right? And so one of the things that we have when we have a language problem when it comes to talking to the public about cyber and digital defense. Also we need, and this has come up time and time again, it came up when we did a very early report out of this at the ACI, is we need a framework and we need rules for engagement. What do we do? What do we allow industry to do? What do we constitute as an attack? We need to start having this language. This shouldn't be new for anybody here. I do think that there's an increased role to be played for the Army and the DoD in taking a leadership position and a partnership position. I, as a part of this, have gone out and sort of vetting these results with industry and going to them and saying, we are seeing this widening attack plane, we think you need to do more, and they tell us, great, what should we do? Like our expertise is not in this area, we want to hear from the Army and the DoD and folks like that to actually go and talk about what should our go dark plans be? Do we need to start having cyber amber alerts, or I love that idea this morning about creating like a worldwide network, much like a radar, that's actually watching the plane and what's going on. And then we think we need to have a redefinition of what a critical system looks like, a critical economic or security system. In some of our scenarios, there were very well-meaning companies, say in Silicon Valley, who send executives to a foreign country who has other interests, and that person has never been trained, has never said, oh, by the way, you go onto this network, you leave your hotel room, there's a very good way when you come back, you have been compromised and you won't even know. And if you go and you tell somebody at, say, a company in Silicon Valley, you tell them this scenario, they will be horrified because they just haven't trained their people to do it. And when you talk to industry about it, they want to. They don't want, nobody wants cyber warfare. Right? Nobody wants hacks. And then finally, in preparing and training for future threats, that's one of the things that I think the Army and the DoD really shine at, is starting to prepare and using this kind of cadence of how you work with people. I know there's some examples that the ACI has done around Jekyll Tech that are really interesting, where you have people doing exercises, thinking about what that might look like. Also, this notion of, I'm going to keep pushing that efficiency is easy to hack. That we get that idea and that notion out there that you can optimize for things other than just efficiency. And then finally, in the definition around these complex automated systems when it comes to artificial intelligence, we need to redefine human interaction in these complex automated systems. What does it mean to have a human in the loop, a human on the loop? What does it mean to have a cyber fighter sitting side by side with an AI or multiple AIs? One of the people that I do a lot of work with is a tools company based in Silicon Valley that is actually making the tools to design the AI, to optimize the AI. The way that he describes it is, imagine having 5 of the smartest people who you've ever collaborated with in your pocket all the time. So if you have to make a decision, all you have to do is start having a conversation with those people, and you're working with AI. And that the goal of the AI isn't to outmode the person, the goal of the AI is to actually make that person better. So finally, I want to leave you with these things. What it will be coming out of this and out of this project is there'll be a series of articles which you'll all have access to because all of this is open source and open to the public. We'll be doing industry report outs, so certain academic collaborations, certainly with myself at Arizona State University as well as West Point and the United States Air Force Academy. But one of the things that we wanted to announce today, and please everybody take a picture of this, is in 2017 we're going to do this again. We're going to do another cyber threat casting. I believe we're going to do it at Arizona State University to get together the right people in the room. I believe a lot of people in this room might be some of the people who need to be in that room. If you are interested in it, please just shoot us an email to threatcasting@usma.edu. What we're doing right now is we're starting to set that focus. So if you have any ideas right now or when I'm hanging around for the rest of the conference, hey, Brian David Johnson, you focused on automated systems, AI, and supply chain. I think you should focus on these things because we need that input. We want people who can make meaningful use of these threatcasts, who can then take that information and go do something with it. And then finally, again, we want wider participation. We know we'll never have all of the right people in the room, but that's why we want to keep doing these. And so with that, I will say thank you very much.
you sit down, we have time for a few questions. Anybody? Great, warm up your engines, and while you're thinking of that powerful question you're going to ask him, I'm going to put him on the spot. So tell me, you talked about the need for norms, and although you specifically shied away from regulations and that sort of thing, and laws, I'm interested in your perspective on what role government, legislative bodies throughout the world would have in securing our future, in realizing those positive futures and in preventing the negative ones.
So this is a sort of a tell of my bias. So as I say, I'm a geek, I'm a tech guy. I sort of come from that world. So for me, how we've always approached things is to regulate last, legislate last. I don't think it's a bad thing, don't get me wrong. It's important, but we should try to do it last. And so ultimately, we start off with cultural norms, right? Because by the way, culture is the thing that we're all living in, right? So culture surrounds us, and for culturally, there's many things we say, this is okay, this is not okay. And I think even from a cyber standpoint and a hacking standpoint, we're not having a conversation about, that's not okay. We're getting there. I mean, especially what's happened in this last year, we're getting there. Like the people are getting an understanding of what's okay from a cultural standpoint, what's not okay. I think then as you move in, you can start getting professional norms. So you have different industries who redo things in this way. You see it all the time. And then I think as you move even closer, you can start getting standards. Standards, I think, are incredibly helpful because standards, oftentimes you have self-regulating bodies, you have industry associations, you have standards bodies who get together, who make a decision. It's messy, it's fraught with problems, but it's a way for doing regulation. It's a way to let the system itself start to regulate. And you see some really great examples of self-regulation in that as well. Then as I think you get closer, right, if you can't take care of it in all those places, I do think it's time for the government to step in. To start basically be the adult in the room and say, well, if you can't get it done in all these places, and by the way, I think sort of government and specifically in this conversation, the DoD and a lot of other federal agencies have a big role to play in the cultural, in the sort of standards and in that. And I think what you'd be surprised as you leave Washington, D.C., I live on the West Coast, as you leave Washington, D.C., people are interested. I've actually found that as we've been doing this threat casting, people are very interested in this because they see that it's a problem and that there's a big delta between where we are now and where we need to be. But ultimately, I do think we get to this point, and I think if you get informed and involved in all of those steps leading up to it, I think you make better regulation and legislation.
Eric from Innovis Incorporated. A quick question about supply chain norms. As you've said that you think there's a call for that. How do you see that developing? You made me think of back in the 90s when Compaq sort of took over the computer industry and started standardizing hardware boards and things of that nature, and through on a commercial basis as a commercial entity, essentially standardized the manufacture of PC building, which is a first. How do you see the standardization of supply chain risk management in that model?
It's a great question. I think there's two ways of doing it. I think your Compaq example is a great one. So I think that the market will push for it. Again, these types of breaches and these types of attacks are bad for business. So you'll start to see, I think, large businesses just start to be able to do it, much like Compaq did it, just because it made them more money, it made them more effective. One of the things I think that has come out of specifically this work is the role that trade associations have to play. That basically the .orgs of the .coms, right? So the way that the trade associations are set up is you've got a lot of .coms, a lot of for-profits that create a trade association, and trade associations, the goal typically is to raise all boats in that industry. And they do that through convening, they do that through education, certification, they have very specific roles to play, but they're chartered to their nonprofits. And as we've been kind of talking to these folks about it, they begin to see, oh, these norms are good for business. Being able to train the next generation of not just cyber warriors, but also cyber defenders on the public side, there's a huge role, I think, to be played there. And it's one that, as we've just begun to start roll this out, we see a lot of eagerness there to do it. And I think by keeping it out of the for-profit world and keeping it still in that sort of non-profit, chartered for good world, I think is a great place to start.
One more question.
You mentioned flags earlier in your conversation. How are we defining flags when you have an AI system that's bringing the big data to people?
Could you wait, don't give it away yet. Could you say a little bit more? I mean, you say the AI bringing the big data to people.
All right, so if you have parameters that mean something's going to be elevated to someone personal, a person versus an automated system, so coming from a black box and an algo to a gray box, the person looking at it as well, how are we getting those flags set up to say this is data that's an outlier that needs to be looked at? And how do you do that with your threat casting?
That's a great segue, actually, to what he's going to be talking about when it comes to anomalies. For me, how I would set it is I would start flagging the need for that verification and modification way before that black box is ever made. Right? So as you start looking at how are you building that AI, because a lot of the work that I do, again, I've reached out to companies that are building that AI. One of the things I think is fascinating, and I didn't say this, so thanks for asking the question. One of the things we've looked at is not only creating AI, but creating AI that has a forensic trail. So if it's starting to make decisions and what it's doing, it's actually got an internal checker inside of it as well. So that as you start having more and more increasing computational power, we're not just having the AI to do a single task, but we're building in some of these subtasks along with it. So you also can have AI watching AI. You can have a trail that goes in as well. So I think one of the things that we can do is in that complex system that you're talking about, from black box to gray box, even how we build those boxes, I think that's where you begin. I think as you get a little bit closer, it gets, there's a way that you can bring a way to bring in data verification, a way to bring in where it came from, but that gets way too geeky, so way too fast. What my normal response would be is I would build the box in a different way.
Okay, there will be time for collective questions at the end, I hope. And with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker, which is Rafał Rosinski. And if Brian David Johnson took us out to the future 10 years, Rafał is going to bring us a little closer to home, but still looking at future threats and bringing an analytical, probabilistic approach to managing risk. Rafał hails from Canada, and he is, like Brian, he's dual-hatted. He has an academic persona as a fellow at the London-based, let me see if I can get this right, Institute for International Studies, Strategic Studies.
Close.
Almost. The International Institute for Strategic Studies. IISS. I'm Army. We love acronyms. So he's from the IS. And on his private capacity, he's the CEO and Chief Innovation Officer at SecDev. And with that, Rafał.
Thank you very much. And I have to say, this is the first time I actually saw Brian David presenting, and his presentation gave me a lot to think about, first of all, but also gave me some idea of why you put us onto the same panel. There's a fundamental tension between the way that I see threat risk and the way that Brian David sees threat risk, and it really comes down to the point, this fact. In his world, and it's not to be pejorative, there is a future that you can envision and be able to backtrack from. In other words, there's a set of criteria or a set of characteristics that you assume will exist at some point in time, and then from that you can work backwards in terms of trying to map the flagging things. In the world that I live in, that future, generally speaking, is only one of several probabilistic futures. I'll give you an example. When this morning I was getting up and in Ottawa to catch a flight here to Washington, I was woken up by my iPhone. I took an encrypted phone call using Silent Circle to my partners in Kazakhstan on the way to the airport. As I arrived to the airport, my ticket came to me as a proximate sort of beam onto my phone as well. And then just as I was getting on a plane, I decided to Skype with my kid. What's unusual about what I said? Well, nothing. All of you guys use this technology. But if I was 20 years ago trying to imagine a world where these technologies existed, I probably wouldn't be able to do it. So for the kinds of clients that we work with, which are mostly government, also corporate, the black swan event is the norm that they're actually trying to model against. In other words, it's the unknowable that is the problem, not that which is the imaginable. So in part of my talk, and this is going to be very different from what you just heard, I kind of want to walk you through a little bit of what is the actual risk environment, or what are the factors that drive the risk environment in cyber which are not actually cyber, but which impact on this environment and have impacted on the trends that we see in this environment, to which we then have to respond through some kind of anticipation. Whether that anticipation has to deal with understanding where the black swans may come out of domain, or how do we actually identify flagging, to use the term, within the cyber domain, within the network domain, that is an indication of a set of criteria that could manifest itself into an attack. And here, for those of you who missed the talk that was given by Chris Spirito in the last session, I think it's really important to recognize that cyber attack is not a singular event in time. It's a number of linked factors that will happen over time that may manifest themselves into a negative consequence within a network. So therefore, understanding how weak signals, weak anomalies may be part of a chain that ends up being a risk event within the network is more important than a singular event to which you react. Okay. So one of the cases, or one of the things that I usually try to talk to audiences which are not technical, but actually is really good to remind technical audiences, is that the context in which cyberspace has emerged has really been in of itself a bit of an anomalous path over the last 20 years. And part of the problem is because we've become so dependent on technology so quickly, especially in the developed West, is we've really missed the fact of how much these technologies are affecting social economic changes which are really fundamental to the way that societies are organized. So the contention can be made that we live in revolutionary times, but like those who live in revolutionary times, we miss the larger cycle changes. We're focusing on the proximate changes. Hey, my iPhone's got a new app. So just to give you one indication of what these kinds of changes are that maybe are not intuitive. In Africa, for example, only about 20% of Africans have a bank account. Yet over 50% of financial transactions happen, online transactions, happen in the continent of Africa. So ask yourself, if one of the defining characteristics of the jurisdiction of a nation state is to put the value on labor, money, etc., what happens when that moves or migrates from the land of publicly accountable institutions to individuals? That's a pretty fundamental change. And those kinds of pretty fundamental changes really can be captured in the fact that we've gone from, in one single generation, effectively life in a physical world which was defined by the 15 kilometers in one which lived, and the 200 people that they would know in their lifetime, to something that has been really global. For us, again, living in the West, it's imperceptible. For people, however, living in Africa, Asia, parts of Central Asia, it's been absolutely transformative because it changed their relationship to those institutions that have always defined the way they live. Slide is behind me. There we go. The consequence of this vast leap into cyberspace has been the creation of data. Again, self-evident for those of you who work in the cyber domain. This figure of 40 zettabytes comes up, describes the amount of data that we expect to be creating on a yearly basis. Now, 40 zettabytes is a lot of data. Anybody know how much it is? I'll take a grain of sand. Every grain of sand on Earth multiplied by 75, and that's what you get. The reality of this, though, of this vast data storm, is the fact that my clicker will eventually work. Eventually. That we've processed more data in the past 2 years than we processed in the entire 3,000 years that preceded it, and that on a daily basis as individuals, we consume more data in 24 hours than a person living in the 15th century will have consumed in their entire lifetime. Now, if these are kind of technological features of the reality, there's another feature of the reality which is even more important, and that's how people actually use it. So some of these figures will become pretty common to you. About a third of us in the entire planet, or 2/3 of us in the entire planet are connected to broadband internet. That's the kind of internet that I have in Canada, people have in Kigali, and sometimes you have in Washington, D.C. There are more cell phones in the planet than there are human beings, and in 3 years, about 80% of these are going to be smartphones, which means they're going to be devices that are capable of both creating, aggregating, and communicating vast amounts of data, not just voice. But here's the more interesting part. Of those connected to the internet globally, 2/3 are under the age of 35, and 50% are under the age of 25. What does that represent? That represents young adults just entering into their most productive years of life. This is where the ambitions of childhood meet the very, very real structural obstructions of adult life. This is the demographic that is most motivated for change. That might be self-evident, but it's also quite important to understand, because that demographic that I just described, those 50% under the age of 50, they're not coming from North America. They're not coming from India or China. They're actually coming from the least developed countries on Earth. These are the new digital natives, born into the 24/7 gaze of the online internet. And what's interesting about it is that that demographic, 3 out of 5 new internet users are coming from countries affected by fragility or considered to be failed. For them, the internet is not playing the Xbox in their uncle's basement. It's not texting their girlfriend on a Friday night. It's a very real mechanism for being able to challenge the status quo, to make real changes to the barriers that they see on their ambitions as individuals, as an economic class, or politically. It's had a tremendous impact. This is a photograph that will eventually come up. There we go. It was taken in Rwanda in 1999 when I was serving as part of the early deployment for the MONUC mission, the United Nations mission. This is a picture that's taken by a photographer just on the other side of the border of Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of Congo. At that time, when I was on the ground, 200 kilometers around us, there was nobody around with a radio transmitter emitter. This is what we used to call an austere environment. Flash forward to a few years ago, and this is what you'd see on the streets of Hong Kong. Literally thousands of people using small consumer devices in order to create agency on the ground. Now, in a way, if you consider that a generation ago, a technology like television fundamentally changed the way that politics was played. Thousands of people standing in front of the Democratic National Convention shouting, "The whole world is watching, the whole world is watching." If you think about the debates that you just watched here in this country, presidential debates, the spectacle of television really is that which shapes the way that politics is played. And if that's the way that television shaped the generation that was weaned into the television age, we've got to recognize that the next generation, which is born into the internet age, is going to have a completely different form of agency, which is equivalently going to be significant in the way that it transforms things. So a couple of characteristics of what this confluence of data with the agency of this demographic that's mobilized to change has created. Well, here's one. Does anybody know what this photograph is? It's a rhetorical question, but if anybody does, I'll give you a point. So this is a picture of an Egyptian surveillance helicopter hovering over Tahrir Square, lit up from below by thousands of people holding small pencil lasers. This is a great example of what you can call radical transparency. That basically there's the ability, that we think of surveillance as being one of the characteristics of technology. Well, it has its doppelganger in the ability of the small and the many to be able to illuminate the actions of the big and the large. That too has a name, but that name is called surveillance. Okay? And understanding the fact that surveillance is one of those characteristics that is also endemic or descriptive of the environment we live in is super important, because it's, like you said, a flag event that you can't go back from. So what's been the consequence of this? Well, it's had various manifestations, some of them political. A few years ago, we talked about the rise of things like the Twitter revolution, mobs being able to effectively create structural change. But if we consider all these things together, well, what impact then does this have for cybersecurity? How does this impact the way that we need to be looking at cybersecurity to begin with? Well, first of all, it's brought into being a whole new class of threat risk actors in this environment that we simply never imagined and never considered. I'm deliberately showing you a picture of a member of MS-13. because few of you in the room will say, well, this is a sophisticated cyber actor. But in reality, the fact that criminal gangs operating in a circular fashion, almost migratory fashion, between North America and Central Africa can sustain an economy that brings drugs and people north and guns and money south is a testament to which these actors have been able to appropriate technology in order to create agency in ways that, again, we never anticipated they would and would never expect that they could, given the characteristics of the individuals that are within it. A few years ago, we tried to quantify this kind of unpredicted and unexpected cyber threat on Canadian networks. At that time, we collaborated with, or were able to join forces with Bell Canada. And unlike in the United States, in Canada, Bell Canada actually has a virtual monopoly over most of the internet backbone. In other words, most of the other providers will go with it, so if you have perspective over the Canadian backbone through Bell Canada, you actually have a lot of perspective on all traffic, ergo you can quantify it. And what we found through an analysis of about 859 petabytes worth of data over time is just how significant what we might call dark traffic was on the networks. At any given time, for example, we were able to identify that between 5 and 12% of all devices connected to the network were under the control of some kind of botnet or other. In other words, they were not being operated by the operators themselves, but actually fell under the jurisdiction or the power of a third party. Secondly, what we were able to identify is that most perimeter defense systems that were instituted on institutions that were connected to the network, it's frustrating. We're not able to detect zero-day attacks. Now, that sounds a little bit counterintuitive because how a zero-day attack is supposed to be undetectable, but what it simply meant was that the perimeter defense systems themselves were unable to even identify the indicators of something that would be a zero-day attack to begin with. So who are, or what were these threats to risk? What is it created? 419 scammers is a really good example of it. The only reason I'm bringing this up is because of the fact that these things have been so successful that they're actually spawning their own form of economy. So whereas you would have thought a few years ago, 419 scammers were all about simply trying to do the smash and grab of figuring out whether or not they can bilk you out of the money that you're going to give them or access through your bank account, now they're actually starting to buy fairly sophisticated rootkits, recognizing that they can use you as a breach point to pivot onto other targets. And who was affected is not just us in North America. This was a statistic that I actually found really quite surprising when we looked at it. We tend to think the reasons why countries like China and Russia, in terms of how they look at regulating their cyberspace, has an awful lot to do with positioning vis-a-vis the West. In fact, these are the countries that have some of the most significant cybercrime problems. And there's a really good reason for it, because if you really want to understand why cybercrime is a problem in Russia, you've got to realize that it's a lot easier to bilk someone out of their money in a way that simply attacks them digitally than it is to involve a knife fight over a fistful of rubles in the back alleyways of Yekaterinsk. This is a low-friction crime, which means with a low barrier to entry, with high opportunity and high ability to be able to jurisdictional issues, of course, play a big role. Because cybercrime can happen in one jurisdiction or affect one jurisdiction while being in the other, it's created what you might call a jurisdictional asymmetry. Probably the best way of understanding this is to hark back to the era of the rum runners, when policing was still organized very much on a local basis. The way that rum runners were able to get around that is by effectively shifting their activities into jurisdictions where the jurisdictions that have prohibition were not able to reach. Cybercrime operates in the same way, and unlike rum running, where effectively we had as one of its consequences the creation of federal policing in the United States, it's unlikely that we're going to have a global convention on cybercrime that will allow us to overcome this particular challenge, which means the ability of actors to constantly work and evolve out of jurisdiction will be an unpredictable factor or unpredicted legal factor in the issue of cyber espionage has benefited tremendously from the fact that we've had such successful petri dish within global cybercrime. And in fact, if you want to understand cyber espionage from my very simplistic point of view, the only difference between it and cybercrime and cyber espionage is that cybercrime tends to be opportunistic, smash and grab, whereas cyber espionage requires a lot more domain experience and persistence on target in order to achieve its needs. At the technical level, however, it's more or less pretty well the same thing. There was talks this morning that spoke about hybrid warfare, cross-domain effects, so I don't get into that, but I think it's actually quite important to understand that the evolution of threat in terms of how it is exploited for cyber warfare purposes really has been its evolution from one domain into a cross-domain capability. And when you look at Russian activities in Ukraine and Georgia and elsewhere, understanding that their understanding of cross-domain effects is probably somewhat more sophisticated than ours is really quite important. This is also really important because I think the bleeding edge of cyber warfare really comes into play with something that we call neurocyber, which is the intersection between network security on one hand and the ability, if you can click that because I'm starting to have difficulty with it, and the ability to be able to mess with informational integrity. And this is exactly what you were talking about in terms of hacking the efficiencies themselves. Next one. The other important thing to recognize, so these are the social aspects or the social technical aspects that affect risks and threats. The next one that is really important to understand is the actual characteristic of the network itself. So this is a fairly controversial statement to say, and I don't mean it literally, but it's important to recognize that the internet was never, ever, ever built as a tool for security. It was built for resiliency. In other words, as a synthetic network that was meant to be able to facilitate the interchange of information data or processing data, it was never built to be segmented in the way that security would require it to be segmented. Moreover, which is also important, it's also a coincidental network. I'm just old enough to remember the internet when it still connected 28,000 people staring at a yellow cathode ray tube in order to be able to share experiments in high energy physics. The fact that it was spread into something that all of a sudden de facto replaced the standards for data exchange that ITU had set and predicted 15 years into the future back in 1990 really was a consequence of two events that people really didn't recognize would come together. One was the end of the former Soviet Union, and secondly was telecommunications deregulation. The fact, however, that's really important here is that the internet was never meant to scale to a global level, and therefore it's a coincidence that it has become an infrastructure for global trade and economy rather than something that was purpose-built for it. And that's the technical characteristic of it. The second issue is the fact that cybersecurity itself is still very much in the dark ages. And there are three things that I would point to that will segue into the analytical component, which I think is important. The first is this. 90% of all successful malware uses DNS. In other words, uses a single technical characteristic of the internet as a way of being able to navigate itself. And yet, only more than 68% of enterprises, which means those who depend most on for cybersecurity, even monitor DNS as a security point or security aggregation point. So ask yourself this. If 90% of the threat comes from a single aggregation point, why is less than 40% of industry even looking at DNS as a means of being able to detect those risks and threats? Secondly, 50% of traffic currently is HTTPS. And the one thing about HTTPS traffic out of corporate networks is that IDS systems don't pick it up. Which means that on top of the fact that you've got a DNS problem, within the DNS problem you've got the nested problem that you can't even identify the traffic that you're looking at. Second 90%. 90% of enterprises currently lack confidence in the ability of their existing cybersecurity solutions to be able to deal with the problem of IoT, Internet of Things. And yet 88% of them are considering adopting IoT over the next 5 years. Moreover, if you look at IoT's significance to industry, if a small or medium enterprise is about 250 to 1,500 seats, the average size of a deployment of an IoT for the same enterprise is about 5K, okay, 5,000. So the magnitude of the problem that they're actually going to be facing is much, much larger than the scale of the problem that they're not dealing with now. The last 90% is also maybe self-evident. 90% of all successful breaches into systems occur through the human vector. In other words, the single point of failure on most technical systems are individuals. And individuals that are susceptible to overcome any technical controls that exist on it. And we've seen lots of indications of this. I'm going to click through these quickly. The famous USB experiment that was run here a few years ago, where more than 68% of employees picked up a branded USB stick that was thrown into a parking lot and inserted into their work computers. When it was a branded CD-ROM, it was 90%. So these low incidence, high consequences events lead to things like the unhappiest woman in the United States a few years ago, who was responsible for like launch breach. Things like Sony that were making believe, even though they frankly were facing pretty well an existential threat. And the fact that we now have actors that can create disproportional effects in the economy using very, very small and targeted means. So Syrian Electronic Army, which a few years ago successfully managed to breach the AP stream and put out a false tweet stating that President Obama had been wounded and the White House was under attack. Well, this one tweet, which was actually phished by the successful attackers, led to a 3-minute, $186 billion drop in the equity markets. Now, this is a very temporally fixed event. It only happened over 3 minutes, but it gives you a sense of just how disproportionate effects can be generated by the relatively small actors. Everyone remembers this particular event a few years ago. There she is, Ashley Madison. We logged, I won't say how many, but in the low 3-digit numbers, panicked phone calls from federal employees asking whether or not there was a problem that would, or something that would create a problem with their security clearance. So, unlike Alfred C. Newman, there actually is a lot of reason to worry about these things. The top risks that we face are pretty well, and this is probably the significant thing, the same risks that we've faced over the last few years consistently. Nation-state actors becoming more sophisticated, well-known attacks still being commonplace, misconfiguration being a general kind of problem, emergent technologies, new waves of attack. The point here is that for most people who are seeking to defend assets, the challenge is that you can't stand still, because the mutability of threats from the social vector, the mutability of threats from changing technology is happening so quickly and in such a quick pattern that it's difficult to be able to deal with it. So can you click this for me, because I'm having difficulty with it. One more. Yep, and one more. Thank you. So I'm going to switch gears and very briefly talk about 2 approaches that can help deal with this kind of multivariate and changing risk. The first is something called probabilistic risk on the human internet, or what might be called attack surface analysis. So what was being talked about by Brian David earlier, this attack plane, in fact for us ends up getting reduced down to a series of tactical planes that happen almost simultaneously at the same time, rather than being stretched out over a longer time horizon. The first of these, so the problem with the attack surface is that it can be very, very small in terms of the vulnerability, but have very large consequences. And the reason the attack surface is a great way of being able to enter into organizations, one more time please, is because it uses tried and proven techniques that just keep on working. Next slide please. The first is the ability to be able to do technical enumeration against networks in a passive kind of way. The amount of information that's exposed through whois directories, through public registrations of IP addresses, which are simply out there because of the nature of the way the internet operates as being able to provide accessibility and routing between distant points, simply means that it's possible to do technical reconnaissance against targets which otherwise would not be possible in the physical domain. Next one. Organizational info, which includes information that's publicly disclosed, but which, using a variety of different link analysis methods, can give you a very, very detailed portrait and picture of the organization itself. Next slide, please. One of the ones that we found for an institution in Canada were contract disclosures. So federal institutions are required to post tenders. If you look at those tenders, by being able to look at the characteristic of the equipment being bought, you would start actually identifying the specific vulnerabilities, specifically on the supply chain and the efficiency side, that can be exploited for a variety of different purposes. Next slide. Social media. This has become the bane for most organizations. Although most organizations now have a policy over what should be accessible or not postable on social media, in reality is the practice is very, very wide, and very often the information that can be obtained is not proximate by the individual that's in the organization, but by individuals that are outside of the organization that actually talk to them. Relatives, friends, others, the next door to them. Next slide, please. It's important to recognize that social media exposure has increased not just because people are talking more, but because more is known about you by the platforms themselves. For those of you who can see here, this is just a comparison of what Facebook captures about an individual from 2005 to 2014. Without having to read the small letters, you can see that the amount of information that's now disclosable and discoverable has become much, much larger. Next slide, please. When we took a look at this from a point of view of a particularly high assurance Canadian organization, we were actually quite surprised how much was actually visible through social media space. Next. We are effectively able to reconstruct through social media or through social graphs entire hierarchies of who worked for whom and where. Next slide, please. Next slide. And in this particular case, one more. Chugging along. No, it's working. Anyway, it's a lot. Okay, I'm going to just come down here and I'm going to keep on talking because this will make it easier. So we're able to find in this rather small organization, we're over 1,000 LinkedIn profiles which are open detailing names, but over 41 million distinct data points about the organization that were simply indexed in Google. And these are data points that actually should not have been put into Google. Next. The existence of engines that allow you for geotemporal extraction, for example, also means that the automation of being able to harvest this data has become bigger and larger and more effective. So the bottom line here is that attack surface analytics has become easier because of the fact that we now have the existence of tools, techniques, and also data out there that allows you to pull in much, much greater data. In terms of anomaly detection, let's switch back here a little more. I talked about DNS before, so I want to talk a little bit about how this actually operates. Currently, a lot of the existing technologies for being able to do anomaly detection are still very much built around the Maginot Line kind of mentality. In other words, it makes a case that there's a perimeter to be defended and certain characteristics that can help identify the threats that actually exist. The problem with that is that you can only defend against what you actually know has a characteristic that you can recognize. So in our case, or rather the thinking behind anomaly detection that we've been working with, has been more one that has to deal with astrophysics, because astrophysicists have one very big challenge. Very often they're trying to measure and look at objects and effects that they don't know what they are and can't measure directly. So how do they do that? How do they get around the problem that they know that something exists, but they can't measure it directly and they can't see it? Well, what they do is they zoom in as far as they can, and they try to gain perspective on what exists by the way that they interact with the space around them. Now this has a very direct analogy in cyberspace. Because in cyberspace, it's also a space where, or rather, we go with astrophysics. So you've got two properties, gravity and time. An object exerts mass and force. So by looking at the properties between two different objects, you can actually ascertain whether or not object actually exists. In cyberspace, you can do much the same thing. All objects are intrinsically linked. And those linkages allow you to be able to measure the actual effects that those objects have without actually knowing what those objects are. In our case, or in the case here, the interaction that we're looking for is the interaction between, on one hand, what exists within the technical environment. In other words, those things which have physical properties themselves, like DNS, BGP, routes, packets, and flows, and the things that influence upon them. And those things that influence upon them are generally the way that the human internet operates. In other words, the data, the people, and the patterns in which those things are used. By being able to correlate those things together, you're able to create a probabilistic model for being able to understand physical effects on the technical side of cyberspace through the observation of the ripples that you see on the social side itself. The upside here is that DNS for security is actually one of the most important things and most overlooked things in cybersecurity because it allows you to bring those two things together. All right, I'll wrap up quickly in terms of takeaways. Is it possible for us to be able to move to a point of being able to predict the future? In other words, is there a kind of a precognition moment here that we can, through the application of models, through the application of assisted learning, to get to a point where all of a sudden there is an ability to look far into the future and be able to predict it? Our answer in that thing is being no, not quite. And the reason being is hopefully for some of the, reasons that I outlined earlier, that when you're dealing with a technical environment whose characteristics you can't actually predict 5 years out, in interaction with a social environment that's changing dynamically within it, the ability to be able to actually model that point 5 years out and work backwards becomes a lot more difficult. Therefore, you really start becoming reliant a lot more on a much more hydraulic, and used the picture there earlier, not this one, deliberately, the hand-drawn sort of spider model, where you really have to be able to look at those proximate indicators as the best way of being able to deal with your threats. Thank you.
So firstly, before we go forward, if you have any specific questions to Rafael about his presentation, let's go ahead and ask those. And then I would like to open it up to a collective set of questions and more of an open dialogue for our remaining 10 minutes together or so. Any questions directly to Rafael? Okay, then I have one, just to start a conversation. So Rafael, you do a lot of work with risk management and really some taking into account a global perspective on some dark futures. What would a cyber pro harbor, what insights do you have into a cyber pro harbor anywhere in the world that are not already been teased to death in the media? What is your unique perspective on what that might look like in the near future?
Well, I think, frankly, we've seen sort of glimpses of this future, but one of the slides that I put up about neurocyber, and that is, the ability to manipulate cognitive thought processes through subtle manipulation of data flows or subtle manipulation of end systems. I mean, David and Brian talked about it a lot, and that's why I found your presentation really important, because hacking efficiency, I think you're absolutely right, is the most important and critical vulnerability that we have, simply because that has been the DNA according to which most of our technology systems have done. We haven't seen attacks yet that are multi-rate, that are comprehensive, that are cross-domain, that actually hack efficiencies in the way that's being described in the model. But frankly, I do think that that's the next phase of what we're going to see.
Anything open?
Yeah, hi, Chris Bronk. I guess my question to you is exactly on that, and it is really, and I think both of you could probably give interesting answers on this, but this idea of neurobiological, informational, or the semantic layer of cyber, where are we going to go to think about that? I mean, and I saw Brian's point on science fiction, but really, how do we, we've got a good repertoire on the ones and zeros, but bootstrapping up from the ones and zeros to information, and information to sense-making and knowledge, and then shaping of conflict in the knowledge space. What kind of advice do you think you can give to practitioners and people who are going to operate in this space over the next few years?
I'll give a very practical one, which kind of comes more from my academic side. I think the more that we have a cross-domain towards cybersecurity, at its onset, rather than an engineering approach and a social science approach, I think that at least gives us the means to be able to tackle this problem from a systematic point of view. Yesterday, I was at an event in Ottawa that brought together all sort of current and past practitioners on North Korea in order to evaluate whether or not Canada should have a new foreign policy towards North Korea. And probably the biggest finding of the evening was we don't know enough about North Korea to have a new policy. And I think this is kind of the problem that we're describing right now, or that you're describing, that the first thing you need to do is put parameters over something you don't know, and then you attack it through the means that actually allow you to evolve knowledge. We're not there yet. You know, what I described as a sort of astrophysics approach to anomaly detection, for most audiences, just doesn't go anywhere because of the fact that it goes beyond the sort of norms in the way that we generally think about dealing with this particular problem set. The moment that you add in the sort of neurocyber components of it, and there's the cognitive effects, you're way beyond where we have any kind of structured approach to learning at the moment.
And for me, in the threat casting, that's why it all starts with people. This is why we were talking before when you said we just don't know enough about the people. Because that is so much of the work that I do really depends upon understanding the actors and actually trying to understand them first. And for me, when it comes to watching that attack plane, you can start to identify, and this would be some flags where it's not the ones and zeros, but you can start to look at the human aspects, right? You can start to look at sentiment analysis. You can start to look at where things begin to change. You can start to look at one of the things that I do with some of the groups that I work with is you create a sensing process that isn't just sensing traffic, isn't sensing breaches, but is sensing literally a change in sentiment and a change in laws and ethics, right? You can actually chart it. I mean, that's the one wonderful things about human beings is that we talk and we write, and there's lots of ways that we kind of track that. It is a bit grayer, but there's a lot that has been written, a lot have been able to track it, and typically we don't create the systems to do it because we think it's too sort of gray or fuzzy, or what people like to say soft science, which sort of kills my social scientist friends. It's actually not soft at all. It's actually real science, that you can actually go and start to watch it. And I do think you can't know it 100%, right? You can't know it maybe as you're watching traffic, but you can actually start to see some of those flags get thrown so that you can put your attention there.
First of all, I just want to thank you, but what I saw in your presentations was quite important and seemed to underscore something that I'm concerned about, which is the asymmetric ability in terms of behavior. That is, we seem to be incredibly good at getting someone to click on something and not very good at learning how to get them to not click on something. Does that imbalance sort of present that ongoing problem?
Yes. Here's what I'll tell you, and I actually would really want to hear, Raphael, what you have to say. For me, this goes back to those new conversations we have with people. We have done a terrible job in communicating the threats and what's going on. Oftentimes, and this goes back to, and I don't completely blame the media at all, it's just we are not giving sufficient mental models for people to understand what's going on. Typically, the mental models we give to people is either everything's okay or everything's going to hell. It's basically either doomsday or Tuesday, and neither is true. And we actually have to develop a much more sophisticated conversation around that. It's happened. It's happened before in lots of other areas, and here we've just not done.
Yeah, I agree on that, and I think it's partially a consequence of the fact that we've seen the emergence of an infrastructure where we've got pretty well all of humanity dependent on it in such a short period of time that we actually haven't figured out some of these things that actually have precedences in other areas. I'll give two examples. One is public health surveillance. The kind of hygiene that gives us the ability to make the correlation between drinking poor water and diarrhea is not a good thing, or washing your hands is something you should do after every meal. We don't practice that in cyberspace at all, and yet very, very simple digital hygiene procedures at the individual user level have a disproportionate impact on basic cybersecurity within institutions. That 90% of phishing is one really good example of it. The other thing we haven't figured out is that security works well at scale, and yet we're trying to deal with it at small scale. Upstream filtering, for example. In other words, being able to look at anomalies at scale and deal with them at the backbone level works a heck of a lot better than having to try to deal with it within every single endpoint network. And we have impediments to being able to do that. In Canada, for example, because of the fact that there's such a high concentration there's a virtual kind of monopoly over the backbone. It means that pretty well every financial institution uses the same backbone provider. And yet, that backbone provider cannot go legally back to its end client users and saying, hey, all of you are affected by this particular thing. Why? Because if those end users happen to be in the financial sector, they'll turn around to the provider and say, well, hold on a second, why didn't you tell us 30 seconds ago? Therefore, you're liable for our losses. So we have a system of impediments over common sense approaches to cybersecurity that exists simply because of the fact that we haven't reached a level of maturity. There's an analogy to this. When automobiles were introduced into the roadways of the United Kingdom or Great Britain over a century ago, who was responsible for regulation? Stop signs. Anybody know? The Automobile Association, because it was felt that only drivers had enough knowledge to be able to self-regulate how they drive. Now, right now, that's patently nonsense. We realize that it's a collective security responsibility to have a publicly accounted body for doing that. We have no equivalent for cyberspace.
One more question?
Yeah, John Kelberg. I'm really glad you mentioned seconds because I've been thinking quite a bit about time. You know, especially when we mention defense and leadership and how society will interact and so forth under, let's say, a big-scale cyber attack. And coming, we have these old leadership models where Napoleon sits on a white horse on a hill. And I just want to see how you see time when it comes to the limits of human decision-making and so forth when you're dealing with an environment that can act at machine speed.
So actually, I wrote a book about this called Humanity and the Machine. And it was looking at high-speed trading. It was a while back when no one really had heard of high-speed financial trading. And for me, it was a moment of horror because just what you were saying. So I'm an optimist. I actually believe that we can actually do good things with technology. And here was technology going off and doing something by itself and actually creating harm. And as a part of that, we started realizing that we do imbue our technology with our culture, with our norms, with what we believe and what we don't believe, with our dreams, with, again, what we value and what we don't value. This, I don't mean to beat up on efficiency so bad, but when I was doing the financial work, I was saying, can you optimize for something other than greed? Because basically it was greed that actually, there's nothing wrong with profit, don't get me wrong, that's great. But greed, sort of the disproportionate desire to profit over something else created some of these problems, and it was actually in how the algorithms were written. And so that's one of the places that I go to, is to say we are going to have machines that do things better than people. This is not new. This is what we do with our tools all the time. We create tools that can do something better than a human being can do, but we also have to understand and backstop it with our culture and what we value and what we don't value. And that's one of the things that is sorely lacking as we are developing these systems. We are not developing with the norms around what we value as a culture. We have very specific things, and oftentimes those are efficiencies, those are greed, those are some things. And I think that there's a delta there. And that delta, as we move through time, is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which is increasing the danger.
Yeah, and I'd add to that by saying, IoT is the space where you're seeing that the most. Whereas, back 10, 15 years ago, it was the financial sector where the sort of algorithmically driven decision-making was starting to get increasing autonomy. There was, as you said, scaled for efficiency, but not for culture. With IoT, we have this problem X factor larger. On a technical level, it's sheer reality that M2M or machine-to-machine protocols are now going to be far, far, far more important than any kind of protocols that have any kind of a device that has a computer interface. It's going to be pretty significant.
And there's a lot of work, actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a lot of, that's a perfect example. So machine-to-machine interactions, right? It's going to happen literally at light speed. So one of the work that's going on, specifically in academia and some areas in industry, where they're starting to look at the ethics and what's the culture of how one machine should talk to another machine. Like, how is that, and I use regulation more in a meta way, like, what is appropriate? Like, what is the culture for how machines should talk to machines? That's one of the things that human beings are actually really good at, is we have culture. Like, when you meet somebody, even if you meet somebody you don't know anything about their culture, we actually have a human level intelligence. Up until now, we didn't have enough computational power to be able to do that. Really, up until now, we were just trying to get the gosh darn thing to work. Now, we're crossing a point, and I have argued we probably actually have crossed that point, where we have enough computational power. And we certainly, as we move into the next 10 years, will have enough computational power that we can actually embed that in those conversations.
Well, Well, gentlemen, thank you very much.